There is a standard explanation for why the great public buildings of the 19th century were built so large. Population growth, industrial prosperity, municipal ambition. Cities were expanding, civic leaders wanted permanence, and architecture was a statement of confidence in the future. That explanation is taught in every architectural history course. It appears in every official record. And for most buildings across most cities, it holds together reasonably well. Until you look at the dates. Not the dates the buildings were completed. The dates they were commissioned. The dates construction began. Because when you map the groundbreaking of some of the most celebrated public halls, exhibition centers, and administrative buildings of the mid to late 1800s against the populations they were supposedly built to serve, a specific kind of discomfort emerges. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet mismatch between scale and moment. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Let's start with something structural. A concert hall built to seat 3,000 people requires, before a single seat is filled, a rehearsal infrastructure, a professional performance circuit, a ticket distribution system, and an audience with enough discretionary income to attend regularly. Those conditions don't appear overnight. They accumulate over decades. And yet, across multiple cities in Europe and North America, you find large-scale performance halls constructed before the cultural infrastructure needed to sustain them existed at any documented scale. The dates don't suggest anticipation. They suggest arrival. Leipzig's Gewandhaus, rebuilt in its large-format second iteration in 1884, seated over 1,500 in its main hall. The city's population at that time was growing, yes. But the professional orchestral circuit that would eventually fill that hall weekly was still forming. The hall was not built for an existing audience. It was built ahead of one. You might respond, that's what vision looks like. And perhaps it is. But the pattern isn't limited to concert halls. And it isn't limited to one city. Consider exhibition buildings, structures erected specifically for world's fairs and international expositions. The standard explanation frames these as temporary showcases, built fast, built large, torn down after. Many were, but not all. Some were retained. And when you examine the interior specifications of the ones that survived, the ceiling clearances, the column spacing, the floor load tolerances, they are not calibrated to the exhibitions they initially hosted. They are calibrated for something heavier, something more permanent, something industrial. The Crystal Palace, constructed in Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition of 1851, is the most discussed example. It was dismantled and rebuilt in Sydenham, a suburb with, at that time, no particular industrial or civic demand for a structure of that size. When it burned in 1936, investigators noted its iron and glass skeleton had been reinforced at intervals consistent with long-term load-bearing use. Not exhibition use. Warehouse-scale use. That detail appears in engineering records from the period, not in popular histories. Now shift attention to municipal halls. Not the ornate civic theaters, the administrative buildings, the ones designed for governance. Here the pattern becomes more structured. In city after city, you find municipal buildings constructed in the 1860s through 1880s that contain more administrative office space than the city governments of that era could plausibly have needed. Not slightly more, significantly more. Manchester's Town Hall, opened in 1877, was designed by Alfred Waterhouse with a floor plan that contemporary accounts described as generous beyond current municipal requirements. The building housed departments that didn't yet exist as formal entities. Some of the designated office corridors remained unassigned for years after opening. The explanation offered at the time, forward planning. And again, perhaps that is all it was. But the phrase forward planning carries an assumption that the planner knew with reasonable confidence what organizations would eventually inhabit those rooms. What departments? What functions? The question worth pausing on is not whether that planning was wise. It's whether such precision, replicated across multiple cities in multiple countries, in roughly the same architectural period, is consistent with independent municipal ambition, or whether it suggests something more coordinated, Not coordination in a conspiratorial sense. Something simpler. Something that the architectural record itself implies. Template adoption. When you examine the floor plans of large municipal buildings constructed between 1860 and 1890 across Western Europe and the northeastern United States, a structural similarity emerges that is difficult to dismiss as stylistic convergence. The neoclassical facade is expected. That was the dominant civic vocabulary of the period. But the interior layouts, the ratio of public-facing hall space to back-office corridor space, the placement of vault rooms, the positioning of archive rooms relative to administrative wings, follow a geometry that appears with minor variation across buildings designed by different architects, for different cities under different government structures. This has been noted in comparative architectural scholarship. It is not a fringe observation. The explanation offered is professional training. Architects in this period often studied at the same institutions, worked under the same senior figures, absorbed the same templates. That is a satisfying explanation. It accounts for stylistic similarity. It accounts for some proportional consistency. What it does not fully account for is why archive and vault placement is so consistent across buildings designed for cities with dramatically different bureaucratic histories. A city that had been managing records for 300 years would have different archival needs, different access patterns, different volume projections, than a city incorporated only decades before its town hall broke ground. The vault rooms, in several documented cases, are the same size. There is one more detail in the foundation records that architectural historians have noted without, as yet, producing a fully satisfying explanation. Acoustic engineering. Several of the large administrative and public halls built in this period contain acoustic treatments, specific ceiling geometries, wall material choices, chamber proportions, that serve no decorative purpose and no obvious administrative function. They are the acoustic signatures of spaces designed for large group assembly, address speech, audience reception, not committee rooms, not council chambers. Something larger, something more continuous. The buildings were used for those purposes, eventually. Civic meetings, public lectures, political gatherings. But the acoustic design precedes the documented organizational need for spaces of that caliber in those specific locations. Which returns us to the same quiet problem. Not that the buildings are strange. They are not. They are magnificent, well-documented, frequently celebrated structures. The problem is simpler and harder to resolve. The organizations that would eventually fill these rooms, in many cases, did not yet exist when the rooms were designed for them. Let's move geography. Because if the pattern observed in European municipal buildings were truly a product of local ambition, individual cities, individual architects, individual governments making independent decisions about scale, then crossing the Atlantic should dissolve it. The United States in the mid-19th century was not operating under the same civic traditions as Manchester or Leipzig. It had different government structures, different funding mechanisms, different relationships between public authority and private capital. If the oversized halls of Europe were a European phenomenon, America should look different. It doesn't. The period between 1850 and 1890 produced, across the northeastern and midwestern United States, a remarkable concentration of large-format public buildings, city halls, customs houses, post offices, federal courthouses, that share the same structural characteristic identified in their European counterparts. They were built ahead of the administrative demand that would eventually justify their size. The United States Custom House in New York, completed in 1842 on Bowling Green, is an early and well-documented example. At the time of its completion, American Customs Administration was a relatively contained federal function. The volume of trade passing through New York was growing, yes, but the building's interior, with its vast rotunda and surrounding office wings, was designed for a bureaucratic complexity that would not arrive for another decade or more. Contemporary accounts noted the building felt underpopulated in its early years. The standard explanation: federal confidence in commercial expansion. But examine the rotunda's proportions, the clearance, the gallery levels. These are not the specifications of a working customs office. They are the specifications of a civic gathering space, a room designed for addressed assembly, for institutional ceremony, for something beyond the processing of import declarations. The building eventually served those secondary functions. Public meetings were held there, formal ceremonies, civic addresses, but the acoustic and spatial engineering was present from construction. Not added, not adapted, present. Move inland. Chicago's first city hall and county building, the structure that preceded the more famous later replacement, was criticized at the time of its planning, in the 1850s, for being oversized relative to the city's then current administrative needs. Chicago in the early 1850s was a fast-growing but still young municipality. The governmental functions requiring permanent housing were modest by the standards of established eastern cities. The argument made by planners at the time was, again, forward projection. Chicago was going to grow. The building should reflect that growth before it arrived. What makes this slightly unusual is not the ambition. It's the precision of the projection. The building's departmental layout, the specific allocation of floor space to functions like licensing, record management, and judicial processing, matched with reasonable accuracy the actual administrative structure Chicago would develop over the following 20 years. Projecting that a city will grow is reasonable. Projecting the organizational shape of that growth, accurately before the institutions existed, is a different kind of foresight. The United Kingdom offers its own version of this pattern, and in some ways a sharper one, because Britain's institutional history is long enough that genuine forward planning had centuries of precedent. These were not young governments guessing at their futures. These were established administrations with detailed records, experienced bureaucrats, and well-documented organizational structures. And yet, the municipal building wave that swept British industrial cities between 1860 and 1885 produced structures that, by any reasonable measure, overshot contemporary administrative need. Leeds Town Hall, opened in 1858, contained a great hall with a capacity exceeding 1,000 seated attendees. Leeds in 1858 had no civic organization, no regular assembly format, no formal public programming that would fill that space on any consistent schedule. It was filled eventually. The hall became a celebrated venue. But the demand followed the building, not the reverse. Bradford, Sheffield, Birmingham. Each produced a major civic building in this period. Each followed a similar internal logic. Public-facing hall space disproportionately large relative to the city's documented organizational activity at the time of construction. Each building found its audience, but in nearly every case that audience arrived after the architecture was already waiting. There is a term used in infrastructure economics, demand pull versus supply push. Demand pull infrastructure is built in response to existing need. A road is constructed because traffic already exists and is causing problems. A hospital is expanded because patient volume justifies it. The demand comes first. The infrastructure follows. Supply push infrastructure is built in anticipation of demand that does not yet exist, sometimes creating that demand through its own presence. A highway built through undeveloped land attracts development. A transit hub constructed in an empty district eventually generates the density needed to justify it. Both models are legitimate. Both have documented historical precedents. What is unusual about the buildings in this pattern is that they do not fit cleanly into either model. They were not built in response to documented organizational need. That rules out demand pull, at least in its conventional form. But they were also not generic structures waiting to be assigned purpose. They were highly specific. The vault rooms designed for archive functions. The acoustic chambers designed for assembly. The corridor ratios calibrated to administrative workflows. This is not the generalized oversizing of a supply push strategy. It is targeted specificity, rooms designed for organizations that, in some cases, would not be formally constituted for years after the buildings opened. That distinction matters. Generic oversizing says, we expect growth, we're leaving room. Specific oversizing says, we expect these particular functions in these particular proportions and we are building for them now. The second is harder to explain through ambition alone. There is another element worth noting which appears in the construction records of several large public buildings from this period, not in all of them and not consistently enough to form a firm conclusion, but frequently enough to register as a pattern. Subbasement infrastructure. Several municipal and civic buildings from the 1860 to 1890 period contain lower-level spaces, sometimes 2 levels below the main floor, that were built with ventilation systems, water access, and structural reinforcement inconsistent with simple storage use. These spaces are documented in original construction plans. They are not hidden. They appear in the public architectural records. What they were designed for is, in many cases, simply unspecified in those records. The function column in the construction documentation is sometimes left blank, sometimes marked with a generic term, rarely assigned to a named department or organizational function. Some researchers suggest these spaces were contingency infrastructure, built to accommodate functions that planners couldn't yet name but expected to need. Others point to the ventilation specifications and argue the spaces were designed for human occupancy at a scale beyond archival or mechanical use. The records do not resolve this. They simply document that the spaces exist, that they were engineered with intention, and that the intention was not, in every case, formally recorded. And here, gradually, is where some researchers and historians, working across architectural history, infrastructure studies, and what might loosely be called alternative historiography, begin to notice that these patterns, taken individually, are explainable. Each building has its local context. Each anomaly has its official account. But taken together, across regions, across decades, across countries with different governments and different architectural traditions, the patterns begin to accumulate a consistency that some researchers have started to group under a broader interpretive label. Not as a conclusion, as a category. A way of asking whether the buildings were, in some sense, part of a shared project, the nature of which the standard historical record has not yet fully described. That label and what it does and does not claim is where this examination has to go next. The label itself is worth approaching carefully, because in popular culture and across a significant portion of online historical commentary, the word Tartaria has accumulated associations that make serious engagement with it difficult. It appears alongside claims of erased civilizations, of deliberate historical replacement, of coordinated suppression reaching into every archive and institution on Earth. Those claims are not what is being examined here. They are, in many cases, not supportable by the documentary record. And they tend to obscure something more interesting, which is why the label exists at all, what architectural and infrastructural observations gave rise to it, and what, if anything, those observations actually suggest. Stripped of its more extreme interpretations, Tartaria functions in the communities that use it seriously as a shorthand, a collecting term, a way of pointing at a cluster of architectural and historical anomalies, many of them documented, many of them acknowledged by mainstream scholarship, and asking whether they share a common origin that the standard historical narrative has not yet satisfactorily identified. That is a legitimate question to ask. It does not require a hidden empire. It does not require deliberate erasure. It requires only that the patterns examined in this documentary, the oversized halls, the specific interior layouts, the subbasement infrastructure, the acoustic engineering preceding organizational need, be taken seriously as a group rather than explained away individually. One interpretation, offered by researchers working within conventional architectural history, is what might be called the diffusion model. Under this reading, the consistency observed across European and American public buildings in the 1860 to 1890 period is the result of a highly networked professional class, architects, engineers, civic planners, who trained together, traveled extensively, corresponded regularly, and operated within a shared intellectual framework that produced similar outputs across different national contexts. This model is well supported. The professional networks of the period were real and well documented. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris trained architects from across Europe and North America. Engineering journals circulated design templates internationally. Civic leaders in one city explicitly visited and studied buildings in another before commissioning their own. The diffusion model explains stylistic consistency. It explains proportional similarity. It goes a considerable distance toward explaining why a city hall in Leeds and a customs house in New York might share certain spatial logics. What it explains less comfortably is the functional specificity, the vault rooms designed for organizational workflows that didn't yet exist, the acoustic chambers sized for assemblies with no documented schedule, the basement infrastructure with unspecified purpose. Diffusion of style is one thing. Diffusion of anticipatory function is another, and the distinction has not been fully explored in the mainstream literature. A second interpretation, which sits closer to the edge of conventional scholarship, focuses on what some researchers call institutional preformation. This reading suggests that the organizations which eventually filled these buildings, civic bodies, administrative departments, professional associations, cultural institutions, were not, in fact, as spontaneous as the standard historical narrative presents them. That the formation of these institutions was, to a degree not commonly acknowledged, planned and coordinated in advance of their public appearance. That the buildings were not anticipating unknown future need. They were anticipating known future organizations whose formation was already underway, in private or semi-private contexts, before they were publicly constituted. This interpretation does not require malice. It does not require secrecy in any sinister sense. Institutions are frequently planned before they are announced. Governments commission studies for departments that don't yet exist. Philanthropic foundations design programs before they are publicly launched. The gap between private planning and public formation is a normal feature of institutional life. What the preformation interpretation suggests is simply that this gap in the mid-19th century may have been larger and more architecturally consequential than is commonly recognized. Some researchers have pointed to the documented activities of certain fraternal, professional, and civic organizations in the 1840s and 1850s as evidence that large-scale institutional planning was occurring before the buildings that would eventually house related functions were commissioned. The Masonic network. Early chambers of commerce. The precursor bodies of what would become national professional associations. These were not secret organizations in a conspiratorial sense. Many were publicly known and their records are accessible. But their role in shaping civic infrastructure before that infrastructure was officially justified by public demand has received relatively little systematic examination. The third interpretation is the one most commonly associated with the Tartaria label in its popular form, and the one that requires the most careful handling. It proposes, in various versions, that the buildings in question were not constructed by the governments and civic bodies credited with building them. That they predate their official construction dates. That they were inherited from a prior civilization, a prior organizational structure, a prior global network whose traces persist in the architectural record but whose identity has been, through some combination of deliberate action and institutional forgetting, removed from the standard historical account. This interpretation is the most culturally visible. It is also the least supported by the documentary record as it currently stands. Original construction contracts exist for most of the buildings discussed. Architectural drawings with dated signatures exist. Contemporary newspaper coverage of groundbreaking ceremonies exists. Payroll records for construction workers exist. The evidentiary infrastructure for the standard construction dates is, in most cases, substantial. What the Tartaria interpretation often identifies, correctly, is that this evidentiary infrastructure has gaps. That some records were lost in fires, floods, or administrative consolidations. That some construction timelines contain ambiguities. That certain architectural features are difficult to reconcile with the construction technologies officially available at the time. These observations are real. The gaps are real. Some of the technological reconciliation problems are genuine points of scholarly debate. But the existence of gaps in a historical record is not, by itself, evidence of what filled those gaps. One interpretation says the gaps were filled by a prior civilization. Another says they were filled by underdocumented construction techniques we haven't fully reconstructed. Another says some records were lost through the ordinary entropy of institutional life, not deliberate removal. The record, as it stands, cannot adjudicate between these interpretations with certainty. And perhaps that is the more honest place to sit with this. The buildings themselves are not disputed. The dates of most of them are not seriously contested. The architectural specificity, the functional precision of rooms designed for organizations that arrived later, is documented and observable. What is genuinely open is the question of intent. Who understood, at the moment of commissioning, what these rooms would eventually become? Was that understanding the product of visionary planning? Professional network diffusion? Preformed institutional coordination? Or something that the standard historical vocabulary doesn't yet have an adequate name for? The Tartaria label, in its most careful usage, is not an answer to that question. It is a marker for the question itself. A way of saying, this pattern has been noticed. It has not been satisfactorily explained. And the explanation, when it comes, if it comes, will need to account for the full consistency of what the architectural record contains. Not just the beautiful facades, the vaults, the acoustics, the basement rooms with no recorded purpose. The halls designed with remarkable precision for organizations that, by every official account, had not yet been imagined.